In the autumn of 1982, a small video rental store opened on Hennepin Avenue in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Mr. Real Video Rentals occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a hobby shop. The owner was a man named Walter Krebs, 53 years old, formerly an electronics technician at Honeywell's defense division. The store seemed unremarkable. Rows of VHS tapes organized by genre, a counter with a cash register, the smell of plastic cases and carpet. But within 18 months, Mr. Real would vanish without explanation and leave behind a mystery that still provokes questions. The video rental business was booming in 1982. VHS had recently won the format war against Betamax, and Americans were hungry for home entertainment. In Minneapolis alone, over 40 rental stores opened that year. Walter Krebs entered the market with modest capital, a loan from a local bank, according to fragmentary records, and an inventory of approximately 800 titles. He hired 2 part-time employees, both college students from the University of Minnesota. By all accounts, it was a standard small business operation. Nothing about Mr. Real suggested anything unusual, at least not at first. The first anomaly was reported in March of 1983. A customer named David Hollenbeck, a graduate student in the university's audio engineering program, rented a copy of The French Connection for the weekend. When he played the tape at home, he noticed something odd during the famous chase sequence. For approximately 3 minutes, the audio dropped out entirely, replaced by white noise. Not silence, but a steady hiss of static that seemed almost deliberate. Hollenbeck assumed it was tape degradation. These were rental copies, after all, played dozens of times. But the white noise segment was so precisely delineated, exactly 3 minutes, that it struck him as unusual. Hollenbeck mentioned the incident to a friend, another audio engineering student named Susan Moretti. She had rented Annie Hall from Mr. Real 2 weeks earlier and experienced the exact same phenomenon. 3 minutes of white noise, roughly 20 minutes into the film. When they compared notes, the similarities were unmistakable. Both instances occurred at approximately the same point in the runtime. Both lasted exactly 3 minutes, and both had the same tonal quality to the static. They began to wonder if this was systematic. Moretti decided to conduct an informal experiment. She would rent multiple tapes from Mr. Real and document any anomalies she discovered. Over the next 2 months, Moretti rented 14 different titles from the store. Of those 14 tapes, 11 contained the 3-minute white noise segment. The placement varied, sometimes early in the film, sometimes near the end, but the duration was always consistent. She recorded samples of the static on a reel-to-reel deck and analyzed the waveforms in the university's audio lab. What she found was unexpected. The white noise wasn't random degradation. It had structure, subtle patterns in the frequency distribution that suggested it had been deliberately added. When she compared the April samples to those from March, the patterns had changed. Moretti shared her findings with Professor Martin Evanson, who taught signal processing in the engineering department. Evanson was skeptical, but intrigued. He examined the audio samples himself, running them through spectrum analyzers and comparing them against known forms of signal encoding. His conclusion was cautious but unsettling. The white noise segments could theoretically contain encoded information. Frequency shift keying, a method used in telecommunications and intelligence work, could hide data within what appeared to be random static. Whether that was happening here remained uncertain, but the patterns Moretti had identified were consistent with such techniques. By summer, the story had spread through a small network of audio engineers and conspiracy enthusiasts in the Twin Cities area. Some dismissed it as coincidence or misunderstanding. Others saw it as evidence of something more calculated. The most provocative theory suggested that Mr. Real was a front operation, a surveillance hub using returned videotapes to transmit information. Every time a customer rented a tape and brought it back, the tape passed through the store's equipment, where the white noise could be read or altered. It was an elegant system, if true. hidden in plain sight, using the ordinary flow of consumer behavior. Then there was the matter of the apartments. In April 1983, 4 apartments in buildings within 2 blocks of Mr. Real were leased to individuals who paid in cash, provided minimal personal information, and rarely interacted with neighbors. According to landlord records later obtained through Freedom of Information requests, the leases were signed within a 3-week span. The occupants were described by neighbors as quiet, professional, keeping irregular hours and occasionally moving equipment in and out of the buildings at night. At least one neighbor reported seeing photographic equipment and what appeared to be radio antennas, though the descriptions were vague and unverified. Years later, researchers attempting to trace the identities of these tenants ran into obstacles. The names on the lease agreements, Michael Connors, Rita Alvarez, James Nolan, Sandra Pritchett, matched no public records in Minnesota or adjacent states. Driver's license numbers were either incorrect or belonged to other individuals. When investigators contacted the landlords in the late 1990s, most had discarded records from that period, and memories had faded. One landlord, however, remembered that the tenants had asked specific questions about sightlines, which windows faced Hennepin Avenue, whether the apartments had clear views of the street. He found it odd at the time, but thought nothing more of it. The possibility that these were FBI surveillance positions cannot be confirmed, but it fits a pattern. During the early 1980s, the Bureau was expanding its domestic intelligence operations, particularly in urban areas, with universities and activist communities. Minneapolis had both. The church committee hearings of the 1970s had exposed widespread surveillance abuses, but by the Reagan administration, oversight had loosened. Operations that would have been curtailed a decade earlier were quietly resumed. If Mr. Real was indeed a target or, more provocatively, a front, then surveillance apartments would be standard procedure. What was Walter Krebs actually doing? That question has no definitive answer. His background at Honeywell's defense division is documented. He worked there from 1961 to 1979, primarily on avionics systems. He had security clearance, though the level remains classified. After leaving Honeywell, there is a gap in his employment history until Mr. Real opened in 1982. Friends described him as reserved, intelligent, and apolitical. He rarely discussed his past work, and when asked about the white noise issue by a local journalist in August 1983, he attributed it to supplier problems. He said he was switching vendors and the issue would be resolved. But the white noise didn't stop. If anything, it became more frequent. By September 1983, nearly every tape in the store's inventory exhibited the phenomenon. Customers began to complain openly. Some stopped renting from Mr. Real altogether. Business declined sharply. The 2 part-time employees quit within days of each other in late September, both citing personal reasons. Walter Krebs was left alone to manage the store. Neighbors reported that he seemed increasingly stressed, closing the store early, leaving the lights off during business hours, spending long periods in the back room where the tape storage and equipment were kept. On the morning of October 12, 1983, Mr. Real did not open. The storefront was dark, the door locked. By that evening, the sign had been removed. By the following morning, the interior had been cleared. Shelves, tapes, equipment, the counter. Everything was gone. The space was empty. Walter Krebs was never seen again. No forwarding address was filed with the post office. His apartment lease, still active, was left unpaid, and the landlord eventually cleared out his belongings, finding little of interest. Bank records showed no unusual activity, just a sudden stop. Utility bills went unpaid and were eventually sent to collections. Attempts to locate Krebs in the years that followed yielded nothing. He had no surviving family that investigators could identify. No Social Security activity after October 1983. No death certificate, no records of him leaving the country. He simply disappeared. The simplest explanation is that he chose to vanish, perhaps overwhelmed by debt or personal troubles. The more troubling explanation is that he was removed, either by his own handlers if he was part of an intelligence operation, or by adversaries if he had become a liability. Without evidence, both scenarios remain speculative. The 4 tenants in the nearby apartments vacated their leases within a week of the store's closure. Again, no forwarding information, no complaints from the landlords, just a coordinated departure. The timing could be coincidental, but coincidence, in cases like this, often strains credulity. If the apartments were surveillance posts, the operation would have concluded once the target, or the asset, was no longer present. Standard procedure would be to withdraw quietly and leave no trace. What about the white noise itself? After Mr. Real closed, Susan Moretti and Martin Evanson continued to analyze the audio samples they had collected. Evanson published a brief paper in an obscure engineering journal in 1985, carefully avoiding any mention of conspiracy theories. He described the samples as exhibiting non-random statistical properties consistent with low-bandwidth data encoding, but acknowledged that proving the presence of actual information would require access to decoding protocols, which he did not possess. The paper generated little attention, and Evanson moved on to other research. Moretti kept her recordings, but eventually archived them, believing the mystery would never be solved. In the decades since, occasional researchers have revisited the case. The rise of digital audio analysis tools has allowed for more sophisticated examination of the white noise samples. In 2011, a data forensics specialist named Laura Cheng applied modern algorithms to Moretti's original recordings. She found repeating structures buried within the noise, patterns that recurred at irregular intervals and changed from month to month, just as the original investigators had suspected. Cheng's analysis suggested the presence of some form of encoded signal, but without the key, decoding it was impossible. She compared the patterns to known Cold War-era encoding methods and found similarities to Soviet and American techniques from the period. The FBI has never commented on Mr. Real. Freedom of Information requests filed in the 1990s and 2000s returned no documents, which could mean the operation never existed or that relevant files remain classified. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it also isn't evidence of presence. The case exists in a liminal space, compelling enough to provoke investigation, but elusive enough to resist conclusion. The white noise, the apartments, the disappearance, each detail can be explained away individually. Collectively, they form a pattern that suggests intentionality. Some skeptics argue that the entire story is an urban legend, a product of Cold War paranoia and the public's fascination with surveillance in the wake of Watergate and the Church Committee. They point out that no independent verification of the white noise ever occurred outside Moretti's small circle, and that audio engineering students are precisely the demographic prone to overinterpreting technical anomalies. Walter Krebs, they suggest, was simply a failed businessman who walked away from his debts, a not uncommon occurrence in the early 1980s recession. The apartments were unrelated, the tenants simply privacy-conscious individuals in an era before digital footprints. But others see in Mr. Real a glimpse of the hidden infrastructure of intelligence work, the mundane fronts and cover operations that exist beneath the surface of everyday life. Video rental stores were perfect for such purposes. High cash flow, frequent customer turnover, and a plausible reason for people to come and go. The tapes themselves were analog storage media, easily manipulated with the right equipment. If an intelligence service wanted to create a dead drop or a signaling system in a major urban area, a video rental store would be an inspired choice. What remains today is an empty storefront on Hennepin Avenue, long since occupied by other businesses, remodeled beyond recognition. There is no plaque, no memorial, nothing to mark the location of Mr. Real Video Rentals. The only evidence of its existence lies in fragmentary records, City business licenses, utility bills, the memories of aging neighbors, and the audio samples preserved by Susan Moretti. Walter Krebs is gone. The white noise is silent. The apartments have long since turned over to new tenants, and the questions remain. Was Mr. Real a surveillance operation hidden within the ordinary commerce of 1980s Minneapolis? Or was it simply a small business that failed? Its mysteries, the product of coincidence and human imagination. The evidence allows for both interpretations, and perhaps that ambiguity is the most unsettling aspect of all. The realization that we may never know what was real and what was imagined, what was signal and what was noise. The case of Mr. Real Video Rentals remains one of those peculiar American mysteries, neither fully debunked nor proven, existing in the gray zone between conspiracy and coincidence. The participants have scattered. Susan Moretti works as an audio engineer in Seattle and rarely discusses the case publicly. Professor Evanson passed away in 2003. The landlords have sold their buildings. The FBI maintains its silence. And somewhere in Minneapolis, the location where Walter Krebs once stood behind a counter, surrounded by hundreds of VHS tapes, is now just another storefront in a city that has moved on. But the white noise samples remain. Preserved in analog and digital formats, analyzed and reanalyzed by successive generations of researchers. They contain something, or they contain nothing. 3 minutes of static that may hide a message, or may simply be the ghost of degraded magnetic tape. In the end, perhaps the real mystery isn't what happened at Mr. Real, but why we still care. Why we still search for patterns in the noise, still look for meaning in the gaps, still hope that somewhere, buried in the static, there might be an answer.